Ursula. Right, so we've still got people joining, but given that
Yeah.
we've just clicked over 8, I might kick us off. Welcome everyone, great to see you. I know there'll be some others joining us. Um, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're all on traditional lands, um, and extend our respects to the traditional owners of all the lands we're on, and acknowledging their ongoing connections to lands and waters, and that their lands have not been ceded, and also extending our respects to elders past and present, and to any Indigenous people that might be on the call today. Particular welcome to you. We are delighted today to have two speakers. Our first speaker is Piers Verstegen, and Piers is going to discuss the current wave of gas developments in WA and give us an insight into the WA scene, which is something that he's been very involved in for many years. He's an independent researcher and analyst with over 20 years' experience, including leading WA's Conservation Council for over a decade. His research publications include Australia's Great Gas Giveaway, which was an Australian Institute publication, and Woodside's Burrup Hub Carbon Bomb in Perspective. When he stepped down from the Conservation Council of WA, today's president and former WA State Premier Carmen Lawrence paid tribute to Piers, when she said it would be no exaggeration to say Piers is a giant of the conservation and environment sector here in WA, and his influence has been felt across Australia. So our second speaker will be Ursula Crowley, and Ursula's a member of our group, and she wears many hats, and she's joining us as the co-founder and chair of Zero Emissions Solutions. She's also a director of Parents for Climate and a principal at Amara Legal and Advisory, and she's going to be sharing some of their recent developments that they've made and undertaken at Zero Emissions Solutions. So after we've heard from Piers, we'll then hear from Ursula. So Piers, a big welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're really interested and excited to hear from you tonight, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline and Stephen, and it's great to have this opportunity to speak with everyone. I'm not sure if there's any fellow West Australians with us, but sometimes we regard ourselves as another country over here, or at least our political leaders do. But nevertheless, we're part of Australia's landmass, and we've got a huge endowment of fossil fuel resources over here, which is, I think, what I want to talk to you primarily about from a climate change perspective. Um, yeah, I probably don't need to say too much more about myself. It's been mentioned that I was the head of the WA Conservation Council for many years, and been on the board of ACF for a long time as well. But these days I tend to work more independently, still in collaboration with those NGOs and conservation organisations, but often I find myself more getting into the area of economic kind of analysis and working with groups like Australia Institute and others. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I've put a bit of a PowerPoint presentation together, so I'll just try and share that now. And let's see how this works. Can people see that? Okay, so this first slide is just a bit of a busy picture with one of the some of the recent publications that I've been involved with and the lead author of, just to give you a sense of the breadth of the kind of analysis that I do, although mostly it's focused on West Australian gas and fossil fuels, as we've mentioned. Now I don't know how to advance through it. Oh, here we go. So just put us in context. Most people would have some sense of this. Australia is the third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. About 1.2 gigatons of CO2 is exported every year from our coal and gas exports. That's much larger than our domestic emissions, but it isn't counted in our domestic emissions inventory, of course. You can see Russia and America are larger than us. That's because they export a lot of pipe gas in pipelines to other countries, whereas we tend to export coal and LNG on ships. And LNG, of course, is just compressed gas and that's liquefied, but uses a huge amount of energy to undergo that transformation process so that it can go on ships. And then it mostly gets sent to Southeast Asia, Japan, and other countries, which some of which on-sell it. But essentially, we're selling that LNG into global markets, and we're about neck and neck with Qatar on our LNG exports. USA is catching up rapidly. They're investing in very large LNG export capacity at the moment, so they're going to overtake us. But at the moment, we're neck and neck with Qatar. And in terms of coal, we're neck and neck almost with Indonesia as the world's largest coal exporter. But I'm happy to say that that is now in decline. Australia's coal exports are in decline, whereas LNG exports are still on the rise with various projects to increase LNG exports, particularly here in WA and in the Northern Territory. I mentioned that we equal Qatar. 60% of our current LNG exports come from Western Australia. And a lot of that is from the Northwest Shelf fields, which are declining, but there's various other fields that are now supplying five separate LNG export facilities in Western Australia. And a lot of the gas that we have here is undeveloped. That means that it still has potential to be developed and exported. The size of our domestic gas market over here, even though a lot of our industry uses a lot of gas, it's tiny in comparison to the amount that we export. And so the demand for development of new fields is really from these very large export projects and what industry calls backfilling those projects as their current gas fields run out. So there's been a lot of advocacy over the last decade, really, in relation to some of these because of the carbon emissions that's associated with them. And I'll talk a bit about the Burrup Hub and Woodside as one of those projects that's attracted quite a lot of attention. And you would have heard of Woodside and Northwest Shelf, etc. But just to put that in perspective, so a third of Australian gas exports come from that one precinct on the Burrup Peninsula in northwest Western Australia, and that's called the Burrup Hub, which has got two very large LNG facilities. And Woodside is the operator of those, but there's also a bunch of other joint venture partners that are involved in those projects. We know that this is partly work that I've done with a group in Western Australia called Climate Analytics. And they're a Berlin-based organisation you might have heard of, but they have offices in Perth. And they focus on the Paris Agreement temperature goals and energy scenarios. And we know that LNG exports and LNG use globally has to really decline very sharply to meet global temperature goals. Whereas what's happening here in WA is there's a large pipeline of new gas projects that's basically quietly progressing through the regulatory system. Last count, I saw about 35 offshore gas projects that are going through the NOPSEMA process. That's around Australia, with a lot of them in Western Australia. They add up to around about 10 billion tonnes of CO2 over their lifetimes. And there's also quite a lot of onshore projects seeking state and federal approvals. And that includes projects in the eastern states, roughly about another 10 billion tonnes of CO2. And then there's others that haven't yet hit the approval system. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about the lack of any organisation that's actually monitoring these or keeping track of them all. It's one of the big concerns that I have. But I just want to focus on, as a sort of a case study, two very recent approval decisions, one that you would have heard of and one that you probably haven't heard of. And they're really about extending the lifetime of WA's two largest, or actually Australia's two largest LNG export facilities, the Woodside Northwest Shelf project, part of the Burrup Hub I mentioned, and the Gorgon LNG project. And both of those have recently had different types of approvals under different regimes to extend their operations for decades into the future, well out beyond 2050 when we're supposed to be reaching net zero emissions. So into the late 2060s and 2070 in the case of Northwest Shelf extension. And that, yeah, they've gone through different assessment pathways and they've been subject to different levels of kind of public scrutiny and engagement. And I'll just talk a little bit about that, um, using those as an example. Firstly, the Chevron one, this is the most recent one. So approval was given only a month ago by NOPSEMA for the Gorgon extension, allowing that to continue operating till 2066 and develop a lot of additional gas wells and gas fields to feed into that existing facility. It was controversial when it was first established on Barrow Island because that was an A-class nature reserve, and there was campaigning at the time on related to the conservation values of that area. And part of that led to a commitment by Chevron to develop a carbon capture and storage project on the island. They said that that was the reason why they wanted to build the facility on the island because geologically it was useful for carbon capture and storage. Most of the cost of that was paid for by various grants from taxpayers, and it's ended up being more or less well, not a complete failure. They have stored some carbon under the island there, but it's nowhere near met its expectations or its regulatory requirements. So but it's the largest example of an operating carbon capture and storage project in the world. Um, with the extension project, which was assessed by NOPSEMA, NOPSEMA is the Commonwealth Offshore Oil and Gas Regulator. So a lot of these fields that are being developed for these LNG projects are in Commonwealth waters. They're not subject to state jurisdiction. And so the Commonwealth has regulatory responsibility over that, and it's done by this regulator called NOPSEMA, which basically implements the EPBC Act and its own regulatory regime. When it assessed, and by the way, it does assess climate impacts of these projects, including Scope 3 emissions and lifetime climate impacts, but it does it in, I would consider, an extremely poor way. The Gorgon extension was estimated to produce around 2.2 billion tons of CO2 over its lifetime. And they estimated that that was about 1% of the remaining global carbon budget. So they said, well, that would have a relatively minor reduction of the carbon budget and therefore it meets acceptable levels. What they didn't say in that, and this is a quote from the paper that they derived that carbon budget from, is that the remaining carbon budget from the beginning of 2026 for a 50% likelihood of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is nearly exhausted, and is the equivalent of 4 years emissions at 2025 emissions levels globally. So, okay, it's 1% of the global carbon budget in 2025. But by 2029, the global carbon budget will be all but used up, and it'll be in that year, the remaining emissions from Gorgon will be 500% of the carbon budget. And then from every year after that, obviously, it's going to be exceeding the global carbon budget until 2070, where it'll keep emitting. So they didn't mention that part, they just focused on the 1%. They also didn't take into consideration that all of these carbon budgets rely on a huge amount of carbon drawdown from the atmosphere. And the IPCC says that all of these pathways rely on large-scale deployment of carbon dioxide removal, which are uncertain and entail clear risks, and that all of these pathways are reliant on huge volumes of CDR, particularly after 2050. There'll have to be a long period of negative emissions beyond 2050 out to 2100. And that technology to do that, the capability to do that is purely speculative. But that's how they derived these carbon budgets, and so they didn't mention that either. It was also assessed as being consistent with the IEA Global Steps energy scenario, which is based on current policies, and that's aligned with around 2.5 degrees global temperature rise. So that was all in the assessment documentation by NOPSEMA. It's not as if they didn't assess it, they did, and that was the conclusions they reached, but they still found that it was acceptable and didn't require any conditions on those Scope 3 emissions. The Northwest Shelf was a separate regulatory regime for that, and that was assessed under the EPBC Act. And as you know, the EPBC Act has no climate trigger, so there was no assessment of climate impacts at all for this one, even though it was over its lifetime, it would produce about 4 billion tonnes of CO2. And that, just to put that in perspective, that completely dwarfs all of the domestic measures that we're taking, the entire savings that will be delivered by the safeguard mechanism between now and 2030, and all of the other domestic measures to reduce emissions are dwarfed by the lifetime emissions from this project. And what it will mean in Western Australia is it'll become so the extension is to operate the LNG processing facility, and that then becomes a demand driver for very large gas fields to produce the gas that it requires to feed this thing. And so they are now subject to separate assessment processes, but again, they won't have any assessment of the carbon impacts. That project was subject to quite a lot of scrutiny and campaigning by environment groups, including that I was involved with. And this is the cover report we released with the Australian Conservation Foundation. It uses this term carbon bomb. A carbon bomb, that is actually a term that's defined in the academic literature as a fossil fuel project or a new fossil fuel project that will result in over 1 billion tonnes of CO2 over its lifetime. So there's a lot of these around the world, but these gas projects in Western Australia are high on the list. And the Burrup Hub is the largest carbon bomb in the Southern Hemisphere at over 6 billion tonnes between those two LNG facilities I mentioned. The fifth largest gas project globally, and again, no assessment of emissions under the Australian environment legislation. What did trigger assessment under the Commonwealth EPBC Act was the fact that these facilities are located right in the middle of what is now a World Heritage listed site for rock carvings, which there's over 1 million rock carvings on Murujuga on this site. It's the most concentrated area of Aboriginal heritage in Australia. Documents 50,000 years of continuous occupation by humans, contains the earliest known depictions of human face in the world, many extinct megafauna that have long been eradicated from those areas, and thousands of these petroglyphs were destroyed when these gas plants were built to make way for the physical infrastructure. But now what's happening is, and there's ongoing removal of rock art due to further development on the Burrup that's related to gas use. And this is a picture of the Perdaman fertilizer plant, which is under construction now, will use gas from the Scarborough project. But a big problem there is the acidic emissions from the LNG facilities mainly that are etching the rock art and causing ongoing degradation of that rock art. Most of those emissions come from the Northwest Shelf facility, and it's been described as Juukan Gorge in slow motion. The amount of emissions, acid gas emissions, it's 25 tonnes, which is a semi-trailer load every day, is released into that airshed. And if you compare that with Lascaux Caves or other places in the world which are World Heritage listed, they don't even allow people to go near those sites because of the acid in our breath, let alone this really heavy industry there. Um, there's independent scientists that have been for a long time documenting these impacts. Um, and this became very controversial when the Northwest Shelf was being considered for approval. Prior to giving approval, Murray Watt said there's no impact on the rock art from the acid gas emissions. And then after giving approval, he then declared that the whole of the area is actually under threat on the basis of industrial emissions. So these are two statements from the same minister. But it's pretty clear where the science is, and that's a major problem for Woodside and these facilities. But at the moment, they're still getting away with it. Um, but just to go back to the gas demand that these projects would create, there's really two major sources of gas that are being now targeted to feed the Northwest Shelf extension. There's the Browse Basin, which is offshore off the Kimberley coast around Scott Reef. And then there's the Canning Basin onshore gas in the Kimberley, which would have to be extracted by unconventional gas development or fracking. There's campaigns around both of these by the Greenpeace and other environment groups. This is some examples of the Scott Reef campaigning. Um, but an even bigger gas resource is actually onshore, and that's in the Kimberley. But to give you a sense of perspective, to supply the Northwest Shelf with gas from onshore in the Kimberley would require up to 25,000 fracking wells over a vast area in the Kimberley, which is really an undeveloped, largely pristine area. So that's also attracting a lot of pushback. Um, and just recently, Premier Roger Cook said West Australia is running out of gas, even though we're exporting vast volumes of it. And we could be forced to frack the Kimberley if the Commonwealth doesn't give approval for Woodside's Scott Reef Browse Basin development. That's led to various different kind of responses, but the bottom line is that Western Australia is not running out of gas. The reason why the Premier says that we are is because he's not enforcing Western Australia's 15% gas reservation policy, and the exporters are not providing anywhere near 15%. And if they were, we would have plenty of gas, but he doesn't want to legislate for that. Um, and the other reason why we're not running out of gas is because we can actually phase out most of the gas use in the domestic economy quite easily and cheaply now using renewable energy. There's a couple of exceptions to that with mineral processing and fertilizer production, but in the main, we can actually phase out most of the gas that we need over the next decade using renewable energy if we wanted to do that, or if the government was supporting that as a program of work. Um, so after many years of banging on about carbon emissions from these projects and not really getting too far, I've started to focus more on the economic dimensions of them. And that led me to do this piece of work with the Australia Institute, just to show how these gas companies are actually taking most of the gas that they do without paying any royalties for it. And that the royalties are actually going to decline from the gas that we do charge royalties on, even though production is continuing to increase. And so we released that in 2024, and that led to the current campaign really that's going on at the moment about whether we should have a gas export tax. And that's been quite interesting because it's opened up a new line of, I guess, critique about the gas industry and demonstrated that actually, they have this halo of being necessary for our economy, but in actual fact, it's the gas industry is resulting in a massive transfer of assets and wealth from the public. We own this gas to these multinational companies, and we're hardly seeing any benefit from it. And here in WA, where we've got all these gas projects, it's the smallest employer by sector as well. So we've been focusing more on this economic side of things because it broadens out the kind of argument and perspective around this stuff. Um, I'm probably going over time, but this is my last slide, and I just wanted to highlight a few systemic kind of gaps and needs as I see them in this ecosystem of work here. One problem is that even though there's all these projects going through the system, and the Gorgon one's a good example, there was no engagement in that by NGOs at all, because there's no organisation that is systematically tracking or engaging with all of these new gas projects across the country. And that's a problem because a lot of people don't have access, well, no one has access to understand what the overall impact of all of these projects are in terms of CO2 or any other impact for that matter. The offshore regulatory regime does consider climate change, as I've mentioned, but there's not much engagement in that by environment groups, and so there's very little scrutiny over the way they're actually doing that. There's been some attempts through the courts to improve that, but they haven't been particularly successful. But we should understand that we do have a regulatory regime in Australia that does assess these impacts, but it does it in a very poor way. There's a real problem with accessing legal resources by groups that are affected by these projects. A lot of it is traditional owners that are affected in terms of their cultural heritage, and they don't really have much access to resources to be able to engage in these developments and make responses. Um, and I think there's a need for a greater diversity of groups that are prosecuting economic arguments. At the moment, it's the Australia Institute and its influences like Conrad from Punter's Politics, but there really isn't any organised kind of institutional kind of focus on this. And what we're finding is that that's the area that actually engages Australians much more than carbon pollution and climate impacts. So I think there's a room for more work to be done there. Anyway, I'll end there. Hopefully, I haven't gone too far over time, and we can chat about any more of this that you're particularly interested in. I know I've covered a lot of stuff, but in the questions, if you want to ask on specific details, happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Pierce. You've covered a lot, incredibly competently and clearly. Look, there's one question so far in the chat, and I've got a couple as well. So if other people would like to ask questions, just jump into the chat and add what you'd like to ask. Matt asked about just early on in the slides about coal. Was that thermal coal or all coal?
Uh, I think that was just thermal coal, but yeah, I'd have to check that. I don't work so much on coal. I did a piece for the Australia Institute that included coal last year, but I'd have to check on that. I'm pretty sure it was just thermal coal.
Great, thank you. And I've got a couple of questions just about, there was a lot there, but with the acid gas emissions, do they have an impact on human health, or is it more just on the integrity of the art itself?
Yeah, the Burrup Peninsula, there's not, I mean, Karratha is a town site that's not too far. It's about 15 kilometers away. The Burrup Peninsula itself doesn't have anyone living on it. It does have a lot of workers on these gas plants, but it isn't considered to be a major issue for health. In fact, it's the emissions in the atmosphere are quite a lot lower than health standards. But the issue is that it gets deposited onto the surface of those rocks, often from daily dew events. There's not a lot of rain on the Burrup, but there's daily dew events that cause a lot of this acid to be precipitated onto the rocks. And so you have a buildup of this acid on the surface of those rocks. And so, yeah, it's not really considered to be a public health issue. But having said that, really, there's just a lack of data, actually. And like a lot of these problems, there hasn't been, comprehensive data collection about the impact of these facilities on health. I would say that the
Mm.
kinds of emissions that are likely to be impacting public health aren't necessarily the acid emissions. There are other emissions of BTEX and benzene and various other things that also come out of these flares that could potentially be impacting public health, but it hasn't been part of the campaign really to date,
Mm.
no.
Yeah. Can I just ask, Piers, that was really interesting and it's pretty confronting when you see those numbers. In terms of the political situation in WA, can you just give us a bit of an understanding of that and just what that looks like? And, it seems to how federal Labor is sort of, um, what that link is back to the federal Labor Party.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we could talk for a long time about it. But I mean, I think the snapshot in WA is that state Labor is very much captured by these gas interests, and we've seen lots of different examples of where how that's come to bear on state policy. But what's more significant than that is the effect that that has on federal policy and legislation as well. And so we've seen a number of examples over the last, well, several years where the state government has essentially stopped progress on national reform, whether it's EPBC reform or whether it's on stronger action on climate change nationally. We've seen the WA government intervene in that in various ways, essentially on behalf of the gas industry, in order to protect the interests of these gas export projects. And that I think that's really had a very negative effect on national politics and national progress. And yeah, we saw that most recently in relation to the gas tax debate, where the Premier was, advocating against having a 25% gas tax. But before that, he was campaigning against the EPBC reforms, against climate change action, and so we've got a very weak safeguard mechanism, etc. as a result, and that really has a lot to do with the politics here in Western Australia, and so that's why I try and focus so much on this stuff because it has not only an outsized impact in terms of the CO2 emissions from these projects, but it also has an outsized impact on Australia's national politics and our progress on these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Mm.
Just while we're on Roger Cook, why you said he's been hesitant to enforce the 15% domestic reserves policy. What's behind that?
There's quite a lot of reasons why the LNG industry doesn't want to provide gas to the domestic market. Um, they make a lot more money selling it overseas. They also pay less tax when they sell their gas overseas. And they know that if they constrain supply into the domestic market, it keeps domestic prices high. So the gas they are selling into the domestic market, they get more profit from. And I guess from the state perspective, the Premier wants to see more gas development and he wants to have a high domestic gas price that provides an incentive for more drilling and more gas development, particularly onshore, but perhaps not so high that it actually destroys demand in industry. So they've been running this 15% reservation policy. It's almost a sort of racket to fix the gas price in WA. They only require, well, they have no legislative mechanism underpinning it for a start. It was recommended by a parliamentary inquiry that they put it into legislation. They've refused to do that because the gas industries don't want that, of course. Um, and so at the moment, yeah, the state doesn't really have any way to enforce it. There's a series of bilateral contracts with these companies, but they're highly flexible in the way that they're administered. And so as a result, we have this essentially a confected gas shortage that would not need to exist if we were actually enforcing that 15% reservation policy. But then the Premier has also said, no, we can't apply the 20%, the proposed 20% national reservation policy in WA. That would be a disaster because our program's working quite well, thanks very much. So again, the Premier is undermining national efforts to get domestic gas reservation in place, even though at the same time he's claiming that WA is facing a gas shortage. And really, it's just because he's representing the interests of the gas industry as far as anyone can really tell.
Yeah. And Liz has asked here, what level of tax should be applied to these large gas companies? If you use a rule of thumb from international gas platforms in dollars, what sort of revenue are Australians missing out on?
Yeah, well, the Australia Institute has quite usefully published a revenue calculator, so I direct you to that. I'm not sure what the number is that it's up to at the moment, but essentially we're losing billions of dollars every year. I mean, in the last year, I looked at it for the gas giveaway report. The gas industry in that year made around $100 billion in revenue from gas exports, and we hardly got any income in terms of royalties. And in fact, the royalties are going down, and now the feds have removed that line from the federal budget because the number's so small. It's not even reported in the federal budget. So, in terms of how much gas tax they should be paying, well, that's a matter for people to debate. I think we should be phasing this industry out myself. And, one consequence of taxing the industry at a high rate means that we then become possibly addicted in another way to revenue from this industry. So really the way that the campaign's been running is really as a way to undermine the social license of the gas industry rather than to actually win the campaign around royalties. Having said that, the Australian Council of Trade Unions have come out saying that they back a 25% gas export tax. I think that would be a reasonable starting point, and that would raise a lot of money to cover a lot of things that we need here in Australia, like cheaper housing, hospitals, etc., etc.
Mm. Yeah, thanks very much, Piers. And in terms of political pushback in WA, I know obviously Kate Cheney, independent there. There was another seat that came very close, and I know you were involved in that, weren't you? Do you want to just talk a little bit about that and what it's like, what sort of pushback there is politically in WA?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the Greens, of course, and they get so far, and I've been a long time kind of contributor and supporter to the Greens in various ways. However, the Greens tend to only represent a particular sector of the political spectrum and have difficulty cracking beyond about 12 or 15% if they're lucky here in WA. So that gets them a few seats in the upper house in Western Australia. But the work that we're doing around economic impacts is really in part designed to broaden out the base of engagement on this issue beyond what would be traditional Greens voters. And really, that's a matter that should be of interest to anyone across the political spectrum. And I think we're seeing that where One Nation even is supporting, some sort of reform to the royalty arrangements, and it shows that it's an issue that resonates across the spectrum. We really tested that out with the campaigns in Fremantle. So Kate Hewlett was an independent that ran in Fremantle, both in the state and federal seats, and came within very close of winning both of those seats. And a lot of her campaign messages, and I worked on that with her, were around these economic impacts of the gas industry, but delivered in a very kind of retail friendly way. So, essentially we're getting ripped off by the gas industry. Our energy prices are going up because they're exporting all our gas. We're not getting a fair return from it. And those kind of messages really resonated with a big audience beyond the traditional Greens vote, and we saw that be quite successful with Kate Hewlett's campaign. So even though she wasn't elected, it was a way to test out some of that messaging in a political kind of context, and I think it shows that it can be quite effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And Natalia has asked, what can we do as individuals to bring these issues to light so that action can be taken? Particularly, I think a lot of our members are on the East Coast.
Yeah, well, as I've mentioned, there are various campaigns being run by the large environment groups around Scott Reef and the more local groups. Like there's a great group here in WA called Environs Kimberley, who's focused on the gas fracking proposals in the Kimberley. I guess just keep up to date with those campaigns. They send around petitions and various things and share those. So that's one thing. And then, the likes of the Australia Institute and others are talking more about the economic aspects of this industry. Don't be shy in, sharing that information and socializing that among your networks and friends and peers, because it all helps to undermine this kind of narrative that the gas industry has managed to set for itself for so long, that it's absolutely essential for our economy and that it would be, a disaster if we stopped exporting all this gas. So yeah, I mean, share that information. Just do what you're doing now. Be aware of what's going on, and share that information with your friends. And the other one, of course, if you're in a position to, is make donations. And there's lots of groups that you can donate to who are charitable and tax deductible. So yeah, really encourage that as well. But yeah, I'm happy to provide further information or presentations if anyone's interested in this. We need people to be engaged in it, whether it's lawyers or people from any line of background, really, because here in WA it is tough. There's not that many people that kind of engage with this stuff, and it tends to be kind of forgotten a bit in the national context. So yeah, if you're in the eastern states, just remember that WA is part of Australia and it's playing a big and outsized role on whether we meet our national emissions reduction goals and whether we even have policies and programs at the national level. So if you can engage in that, then that's really, really useful.
Thanks, Piers. I think sometimes on the East Coast, we just don't hear a lot of detail. We don't hear a lot of stories and we don't hear a lot of detail. The big things are reported, but you have to really be tuning in to hear about them. So thanks for those tips. That's really helpful. And Ray, thanks for putting in the campaigns as well. There's 3 links that Ray's shared. One's around the Polluters Pay campaign, or 2 links about that, sorry, and one around Environ's Kimberley.
Yeah.
We've got one more question, Piers, that we might ask before, unfortunately, we're going to run out of time because it's been so interesting. Kate's put up a question about the intervention from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Northwest Shelf case between ACF and the Australian government, putting a new level of international scrutiny on Australia's climate justice and human rights obligations. And will this make any difference, do you think?
I hope so. There's 3 court challenges against the Northwest Shelf extension, one in Western Australia by Friends of Australian Rock Art against the state approval. Friends of Australian Rock Art also challenging the federal approval. And of course, the ACF, the Australian Conservation Foundation that's been mentioned. The Special Rapporteur has joined both of those federal cases by Friends of Australian Rock Art and ACF. The ACF one's pretty well resourced. They're a big organisation. Friends of Australian Rock Art's a much smaller group. So if you can support them, please do, because they're having to, do a lot of fundraising to pay those legal bills. We are hopeful that the arguments that will be brought by the UN Special Rapporteur, this flows from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice determination that was handed down, I think, earlier this year or last year, which said that other countries that are impacted by climate pollution that's caused in Australia would have a legal recourse to seek compensation for those damages from the Australian government. And the UN Special Rapporteur is going to bring some of those sorts of legal arguments into the domestic context. Whether that's successful or not is yet to be seen. It really depends how the court approaches those questions. The EPBC Act, in part, is there to give effect to global treaties, but some of this stuff isn't really established in global treaties so much as other types of international law. So it's definitely one to watch. And if progress is made there with those cases, it'll have potentially a really significant precedent that will then apply to other assessments going forward in the future.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Piers. That's been really, really interesting and great to hear, what's happening in WA and what you're doing and everyone there. So thank you so much. It's really, really important, and yeah, great to get an insight there. Also interesting, Kate has just mentioned that in the Environment's Kimberley's mailing list is a good way to get updates on what's going on in the Kimberley. And Anne Polina, Professor Anne Polina, following her as well. Anne's actually part of our group, and some of you might have seen her on some of our sessions in the past. So Piers, really good. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Now I'm going to turn to Ursula. So Ursula, thanks for joining us. Ursula's going to give us a quick sort of 10-minute overview about electrifying your home. So thank you. Over to you, Ursula.
My pleasure, Carolyn. Stephen, thank you very much. Can everyone see that on screen? Yes. Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for your time, and congratulations, Stephen and Carolyn, on the thriving community you've brought together. So we're here because our professional backgrounds have brought us to climate. My work experience is corporate law, capital raising, investment banking, and now I do this specifically for companies accelerating the transition to a low carbon future. But tonight, for less than 10 minutes, I'm speaking briefly about something that's personal, practical, and powerful. So many of us would like to go electric in our homes, but who finds it time consuming? Who finds it challenging? Who finds it too complex? And hopefully, most important, yes, is who would like simple information about why and how. So thousands of people, tens of thousands or more people feel the same. This is why friends and I started our practical side charity, Zero Emission Solutions, and we're volunteers providing website, resources, videos, downloadables, guides, and events to help people go electric. And I can see Kate and Chris, who have both been involved, Chris particularly, great that you're here as well. So up on screen, you have our 5 checklist guides. I'm going to go through them briefly, and you'll all get a copy afterwards. And special thanks to Carolyn, whose business created the beautiful design on each of these guides, pro bono, much appreciated. So we've all heard of the home battery rebate. This is just briefly on the big picture of what's possible here before I get into the detail of what we can do in our homes. So the home battery rebate, Australian government's cheaper home battery program, has driven massive consumer uptake. Over 420,000 households installations. We've added over 11 gigawatts of grid storage in less than a year. Australia now ranks 3rd globally across home and utility scale battery storage, behind only China and the US, which is incredible. So down to our individual homes, how much do you think each household could save if we replace our fossil fuel appliances, including gas and petrol, with solar, battery, electric car, electric appliances? Well, modelling suggests that the average Australian household will save about $4,000 annually, and that's taking into consideration the upfront costs, and more than half of our household emissions per household. And to put that in perspective, over, say, the 10 to 15 year life of the average appliance, that's, say, up to $60,000, and over 25 years of solar panel life, which is the current warranty on solar panels, that's $100,000. This is per household. And Saul Griffith, Rewiring Australia, says on a macroeconomic level, domestic electrification is save the economy about 1.7 trillion by 2050, which is incredibly impactful for Australians and our businesses. So next 5 minutes is just the why of the 5 key ways to electrify your home. The how to do it is a bit less interesting, so I'm leaving that to the checklist guides. And as you can see, we've literally got check boxes in terms of the steps to take for each of these. But I'm particularly interested in explaining why. And this is of interest if you want to. What I really hope we all go away with today is for a few hours across a few weeks of effort, you're going to be locking in massive cost and emission savings for up to 25 years. So we're going to talk about rooftop solar, home batteries, hot water heat pump, reverse cycle air conditioning, and induction cooking. And our big picture goals is lower bills, better homes and smarter energy. So first on solar. So rooftop solar, as we know, it's generating our own power with our own roofs. It's your own home energy system. Solar is by far the cheapest source of delivered energy in Australia now. So the grid's selling you electricity at around 30 cents or more a kilowatt hour. Anyone know what solar from a rooftop costs? About 4 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So vast difference. A smallish home solar system, say 5 to 6 kilowatt system, will save you about 1,500 to 2,000 a year. And a larger 10 kilowatt system will save $2,000 to $5,000 a year, depending on how much electricity you're using and when you use your electricity. Big thing to remember with solar is once you have rooftop solar, you want to be using your appliances during the day as much as possible. And that might be because you're home or because you're putting everything on timers, including heating and cooling your home during the day, and doing things like, if you want to maximise your saving and minimise your impact on the environment, just basic things like closing the curtains, keeping your house cool or warm. Something not everyone knows too now is panels have warranties for 25 years or more. So the savings just add up and add up and add up over the years. And we have government incentives to reduce the upfront costs that are still in place. And there's now evidence that homes with solar panels are selling faster and at higher prices, and they're going to be increasingly popular. And fundamentally, solar is producing your own power during the day for free once you've got the solar panels on and powering all your electric appliances, including these days charging your electric car. Going on to the next one, installing a home battery. So solar produces your energy, batteries let you keep it. And as well as filling your battery up and being able to use it during the day, we're all particularly cognizant of the fact you can fill your battery up and use it in the evening. Now, electricity prices are highest during about 5 and 9 p.m. If your battery's full, then you can use your own power in the evening, not pay peak rates. So on top of the solar savings I mentioned, your battery should be saving you around $1,000 a year extra. And over 15 years, obviously that's 15,000 plus. And the savings are only going to get better as power prices increase. And then 4 more great benefits of having a battery. Depending on your setup, you can have blackout protection. So make sure you ask for this type of setup, but if the grid goes down, you're still powering your own house with your own battery. Greater energy independence, opportunity to earn credits through virtual power plants, and my personal favourite is that we're reducing Australia's demand for coal and gas burning power during peak hours, which is an incredibly important part of the transition to renewable energy. Third, heating and cooling. So there's 2 aspects to this. This is generally a household's biggest cost, but it's also a massive investment in comfort. So how many people don't put their heating on or don't put their cooling on because of the cost? Having solar and going electric significantly changes that. So heating and cooling is generally about 40% of our power bills, and reverse cycle air conditioning, known as heat pumps, for heating and cooling is around 2/3 cheaper. So just to put that in perspective, using gas, average running cost is about $1,000. Electric is about $1,500, and a heat pump is modelled at around $350. So huge difference. So you're saving up to say $12,000, $15,000 over 15 years, and with solar that's going to be even more. But there's other benefits as well. So if you have reverse cycle air conditioning, you've just got one system that's doing your heating and cooling, rather than often houses have heating appliances and air conditioning. It's also far cleaner and healthier than having gas heating inside. And as I touched on at the start of talking about this, it's guilt-free heating and particularly cooling, because when it's hot outside and your solar panels are generating power, that's when you've got your air conditioning on, using the solar that you generate to cool your house. So this is a huge financial and a huge comfort upgrade. Fourth, hot water heat pump. This is a quiet achiever. We don't think about our hot water necessarily unless it's not there. But hot water is actually a major energy cost in your house, and hot water heat pump transforms it. So it'll cut your hot water costs by about 2/3, saving you about $6,000 over 15 years average household. And with solar, that gets up to about $9,000 or $10,000 average household. They're incredibly efficient. They use about 70% less energy than a standard system. This alone reduces your household emissions by 2 to 3 tonnes. And once again, if you're powering your hot water by your rooftop solar, your hot water becomes almost free. Last of all is induction cooking. The least exciting thing about induction cooking is the money it saves. It's about maybe $100 a year to cost to run, compared to about $360 for gas. So there's some cost savings. But the other benefits are the most exciting parts about induction cooking. So compared to gas, having induction cooking is far better for your air quality. Gas cooking's linked to health impacts, including a serious link to childhood asthma. Also, induction cooking gives you faster and more precise cooking because it's a specific number. It's far safer. There's no open flames. Personally, having teenagers who like cooking, I've felt so much better when they were using induction cooking compared to having naked gas flames and being forgetful and wandering off, which did happen. Second last, for induction cooking, it's just so much cleaner and easier to use, like literally cleaner, not in terms of gas, but it's one glass sheet to wipe down rather than a fiddly gas cooktop. It's so much easier. And then last of all, often people's last appliance that they change from electric to gas is from gas to electric is cooking. So if gas cooking is the last thing you've got, then once you disconnect from gas, you can stop paying your gas connection fee, which is a significant saving. So, in conclusion, what happens when you combine all of the things I've just mentioned? You get a house producing its own power, storing energy for peak times, and running an ultra-efficient appliances. You're saving thousands each year, you're saving tens of thousands over the lifetime of the systems, and you're protecting against rising energy costs, as well as that blackout protection. You're also increasing your property value and you're improving your own air quality and comfort. My most powerful 3 points, which are hopefully going to help propel you through the hassle factor that is going electric, because it is some bother and it is some hassle. First of all, going electric is one of the smartest financial decisions you can make at the moment, particularly with cost of living pressures. Second, like voting, going electric is a really powerful collective action. We know how voting impacts governments. Going electric defunds coal and gas companies and stops all that environmental harm from extracting and shipping the coal as well as burning it. And last of all, we're starting to see this emerge more, and I personally love this. We going electric benefits the community, including those who can't afford to electrify. For example, the solar sharer offer in New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia is giving 3 hours of free electricity in the middle of the day to eligible households. They don't have solar, but they're benefiting from yours. And home electrification is creating thousands of local jobs across Australia. So a relatively small amount of effort is giving you long-term financial, environmental and community returns. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ursula. There's so much fantastic information in these how-to guides. It can be a little bit overwhelming, I know, and hard to get started, and also hard to know where to look for information. I know we're not the only ones who found that along the journey. So, and we've got halfway, we haven't finished. So great, these guides will help give us the nudge to finish those last annoying gas connections. I don't I don't want to put you on the spot, but I wondered with the new 3 hours free of solar, some people, certainly some people in our group and other people have also mentioned that sometimes they can't put solar panels in due to their roof or other reasons. But
Yeah.
I wonder if people put in a battery with the 3 hour free solar, is that going to be something that people can then
Yes.
charge their battery even if they can't have solar?
Yes. Yes.
So I see
Yes.
some nodding.
Yeah. No, that is a really good point. A bat a battery lets you basically you can charge it when power is cheaper and use it in the evening instead of paying for grid power. Like at the very
Yeah.
least, you can do that even without the 3 hours free. The cost difference between buying power, filling your battery when the power is cheap, and using that instead of grid power in the evenings. I understand the modelling is that alone makes it worthwhile. Yeah.
And I suppose with 3 hours free in the middle of the day, I think we'll all be eligible for from the 1st of July. You do have to opt into that, I understand. But yeah, I can imagine that will make the numbers stack up for a battery, even if you can't do the solar yourself.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
Thank you, Ursula. That's amazing. Jenny, thank you also for lots of
Yes.
comments
Thank
in the
you,
chat.
Jenny. Thank you so much. I'm
Uh,
reading them now. I really appreciate that. Thank
I
you.
don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you wanted to jump in and just
Oh,
make a
it's
comment at
it's
all.
just my day job. So, um, and so I'm I've been in this industry for about 40 years in various guises, and it's so many times it comes around again. I think now we're placed better than ever to be able to take advantage of the momentum that's being built up in Australia and overseas for solar on rooftops, for energy efficiency, for efficient heat pumps, though there's still a lot of misinformation out there that is impeding a lot. I love the installation checklists, etc. One of the initiatives I've got with Arena at the moment, and we've got fingers crossed that it will be funded, is to develop a national home energy upgrade hub. And the aim of this is to enable not households, but enable community groups and councils to run their own programs, to give them all the tools, all the templates, to be people there to talk to do mentoring, so that we can spread across Australia to empower all communities to upgrade with resources such as this, and also a lot more like how do you pick the products, how do you choose in your own community who's going to be your best installers. There's a whole range of things that we're hoping, cross fingers, and we want everybody to join us as well, because this is a community initiative to try and make home energy upgrades, including solar and batteries, just BAU, rather than being difficult, being overwhelmed by information, by being spooked by charlatans who come in to make a quick buck kind of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jenny. That's great to know about, and I hope it goes really well. Ursula, with the guides, is it okay for we'll circulate them with the notes after this? Is it okay if others want to share them more widely
Share them absolutely
for
everywhere,
those that
please.
work in the
Yeah.
sector or whatever? Yeah,
Yep.
great.
They're
And
also
also, there's
available on our website. Everyone can download them. Like they're available for the public, everyone, everywhere. Yeah.
great. And one question from David, which is a great one, is can you get the battery rebate? If you is the battery rebate only applicable if you have solar?
Look, my understanding is you do, and certainly look, as a couple of months ago, you do have to get some solar as well as a battery. You either have solar or you have to get some solar. But We don't want people to have a way around it. We want people to put as much solar on as they can. But if your roof is just, you know, really difficult, you can put a small amount of solar on and still get that battery rebate. Yeah.
Yeah.
And look,
And can I add, even without the battery rebate,
yeah,
depending on your economics, it still may be cheaper to get the battery and then arbitrage at night when it's cheaper. Not that I want to promote fossil fuels in the evening, but and then use the 3 hours of free power, which also will be coming in Victoria from the 1st of, I think, October. So we'll have 3 states doing that. So there's different economics for different people.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Ursula. Pierce has added a comment as well in the chat, so definitely check the chat out. I was just going to comment one more thing about batteries. I went to the Smart Energy Council Summit, which some of you might have been at probably a month ago. And the number of batteries, different options for batteries that are available now that weren't available even 3 or 4 years ago, it's just astounding. There's so many different brands, there's different sizes, different configurations, there's just a lot out there of options. If you are looking for a battery, it's worth having just a look at the different brands and so on.
yeah.
Good.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Ursula. You did that so well. 10 minutes, and we've got we've got a roadmap. So we'll send all those around. And thanks for everyone for joining the session this evening. It's been a really great session. In terms of next month, I've got another great session. We've got Bathan Mullen. And Bathan is the CEO of the Superpower Institute. And he's going to be talking about really how Australia can be a renewable and an energy superpower and all the economic benefits of that going forward. And we've also got Tom Woodruff, who's just recently written a book called Power, Prosperity and Planet. And that does dovetail a bit into what Bathan's going to talk about. And he launched his book recently, and it was launched by Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull. So again, quite high profile there. So that should be another great session. And yeah, thanks again, everyone. And we'll see you next month.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks to our speakers as well. Great to see you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.